So, unfortunately, today's topic is a very difficult one, but it's a very important one as well. You see, according to childhelp.org, a new case of child abuse is reported in the United States every 10 seconds. And that doesn't even include all of the many cases that never go reported. That's why today we're talking with Jennifer Greenberg, author of the new book, Not Forsaken, A Story of Life After Abuse, How Faith Brought One Woman from Victim to Survivor. In this interview, Jennifer is talking about her story as she grew up the daughter of a sexual abuser, as well as how that shaped her faith and how she eventually went on to become a Christian singer and author and somebody who has experienced recovery from such a horrible tragedy. Whether you have experienced abuse yourself in the past, you know someone who has, and you want to be a good friend for them, or even just if you live in a community of other people, you go to church, you have friends and family, your kids go to school with other people who may be going through these issues. This is such an important topic, so I really hope you will listen in today to hear all of the wisdom and advice that Jennifer has to share. Today we're talking with Jennifer Greenberg, author of the book, Not Forsaken, A Story of Life After Abuse, How Faith Brought One Woman from Victim to Survivor. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, will you start us off just by diving in and telling us a little bit about your backstory, who you are, what we should know about you before we start this conversation today?
Absolutely. Well, I'm Jen Greenberg, and I am the survivor of 21 years of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and psychological abuse at the hands of my church-going father. And so I'm very grateful. God saved me at a very young age. Even though my family was very dysfunctional, we were members of solid churches, Bible-believing churches, and so on Sundays, I had the benefit of listening to sermons by godly men preaching the gospel. During the week, my mom faithfully read the Bible and prayed with us. But there was also, of course, a twisting of Scripture and a lot of spiritual abuse and just the very confusing messages that abuse sends to anyone. But I think particularly a child.
So you said for 21 years. Did this happen from the time that you were an infant?
It's for as long as I can remember. My earliest memories of abuse date back to when I was about 2 years old.
Okay, wow, that is terrible. When did you realize, I'm just curious, when did you realize that what was going on was not normal? Did you know the entire time, or was it something that you had to look back later and realize?
You know, it was a little bit of both. When you're a child growing up with abuse, it's what you're used to. And of course, everyone, wants to imagine the best of their parents. There are superheroes. I think I knew probably starting when I was probably about 10, maybe 9 years old, that my dad wasn't normal, that he had what I called anger issues. And then slowly as I began to mature and I got to know other men in our church and observe the families of friends, I slowly began to understand on a more and more adult level what was happening in our family. But it wasn't really until I was about 15 that I realized that my dad was a sexual predator. And at that point, I became suicidal because I just felt trapped and I was heartbroken. And I felt betrayed and abandoned. But it really, the realization, honestly, some of it's still happening. When I got married to my husband, Jason, I began to become used to what it's like to live with a godly man, a man who's patient and kind and is interested in my career and my hobbies. And so, at that point, I learned to a new degree how dysfunctional my past had been. But then again, when I had children, I was able to look at my own children with the eyes of a parent and realize to a new degree, again, the level of betrayal and really depravity that had occurred.
Yeah, I can see that even in my own life, even as somebody who didn't suffer from abuse when I was little, but watching my husband, the way he interacts with me, the way he interacts with our kids, just seeing that example of a good, godly man and what that's supposed to look like. I know so many times people say that our image of what we see God like is based in large part on how we see our fathers. How did growing up in this situation affect the way that you viewed God as you were growing up?
Absolutely. It really made, growing up with child abuse really made understanding God as a father very difficult. You know, when you have a father, a biological human father, who is violent, who is angry, uh, uh, sexually perverse, predatory, emotionally abusive, unmerciful, impatient, unloving. It's hard to understand what God means when He tells us He's our Father. And of course, what He means is that He's protective, that He's loving, that He wants to teach us, to guard us, and to grow us more and more into His image as we mature spiritually. And of course, that is such the opposite of what my earthly human father was.
So let me ask you, because obviously I know that you don't see God in the same way today that you did when you were a child. How did you kind of start to begin that transformation? What happened in your life that allowed you? I mean, you mentioned your husband already, but what else has happened in your life that kind of allowed you to get a better picture of who God is?
Absolutely. Well, my when I was probably about 11 years old, I started to realize that my dad, I don't think I would have said it in these words, but I started to have the first inkling that he was dangerous, and that he was a sexual predator. And I started having recurring nightmares about being raped. And I realized that my dad didn't love me, at least not in a normal way. And I actually stayed up probably until 2 or 3 in the morning, um, just praying and weeping and asking God, I told God, you told me, blessed are those who weep, and that you are faithful. And I said, well, I'm weeping, I'm crying, and I really need you to step into my life and to be my father. We had heard a sermon that Sunday about how God calls himself Abba. And our pastor had told us, that means daddy. You're able to run to God like a little child and call him daddy. And so I asked God, I told him, this man in my life who I call dad, he's not safe. He feels like a stranger to me. I'm afraid of him. And, I told God, I'm going to need someone in my life to guide me. I'm about to turn into a teenager. I'm growing up and I need guidance. I need help and I need protection. And even though, you're not physically here, I need you to step into my life and somehow fill his shoes. And when I prayed that, I just got an overwhelming sense that I was heard and that God loved me and that he was going to be there for me as my father.
Did you have other positive male role models at the time, maybe like friends or other family members who had dads where you could see a better picture of this is what a dad should look like? And did any of them have any idea that anything was going on?
I don't think so. There were, of course, our pastor. There were elders who maybe taught, youth Sunday school, that sort of thing. But one of the things that was odd about my family, we were homeschooled. And so I was very isolated. And I think that was on purpose. Looking back, I really feel that, while my mom wanted to provide us with, tailored education and daily Bible reading and prayer throughout the day, that sort of thing, good things. Um, ultimately what ended up happening was we were separated from others, and we didn't get involved much in support groups or much with church during the week. And so I didn't really get to know my friends' dads too well, and I honestly don't think that anyone had any idea what was going on.
So I'm really curious to know, now that you said that it happened for 21 years, or give or take, I would assume that you are not in an abusive situation anymore. I would really hope not. How did that kind of come to an end? Was it just that you grew up and moved out? Did you somehow find the courage to report it, or what happened?
Kind of all the above over the course of several years. When I got married at the age of 21, and I met Jason in college, and I fell in love with him, and like I said, I slowly began to acclimate to getting used to living with a godly man. I did try to patch things up with my dad, um, but there was too much dysfunctional behavior, and the abuse was ongoing. And at one point, and not physical abuse, of course, but just the psychological and emotional abuse. There would be times when he would claim to be sorry for what he'd done, and I'd be hopeful and excited, thinking, well, maybe God is saving him, and maybe our relationship is going to get better, and he's going to change. But then maybe a week to a month later, he would revert, and he'd say, I don't remember apologizing. I don't remember ever doing any of those things. You're imagining things. And so finally, after at least a year of that, I told my dad over the phone, and I said, I can't do this anymore. This is tearing me apart. And I told him, like, I have two choices. I can either believe that you're crazy and you don't understand what you did, and your memory is going in and out, and, and this is somehow not your fault, or you're evil, and you know exactly what you're doing, and you're doing this on purpose. And to my memory, he was quiet for a few seconds, and then he said, well, I'm not crazy, so you're just going to have to get used to the fact that I am evil. And I was done. I was finished, and I told him I can't do this anymore. It's affecting my marriage, it's affecting my emotional health. And later I told Jason what had happened, and eventually he contacted my dad and told him not to speak with me again. No more birthday cards, no more phone calls, no more emails, nothing. And he said, when Jennifer wants to talk to you again, if she wants to talk to you again, she can reach out, but you must not communicate with her at all. So that was the end of that. And it really marked a huge growth spurt in my spiritual recovery, just not to have that toxic behavior in my life.
That is honestly so brave of you that you were able to make that decision too. I know so many people who struggle, I mean, not personally, but I know that there are so many people who struggle with abuse, where you have that element too, especially if it's family or if it's someone you've known a long time, to figure out, is it appropriate to cut ties with them, or is it something where you keep forgiving and hoping for the best? Do you have any advice for somebody who may be in a situation right now that, whether it's abusive or it's just a toxic situation that they need to get out of, how can somebody kind of begin to determine, is this something where you need to keep forgiving, keep praying, keep hoping, or how do you know when it is time to cut those ties and let yourself go?
Absolutely. Well, obviously we want our loved one, whether that be a parent, your mom, your dad, a sibling, a spouse, whether it be your husband, your wife, whoever it may be, you want them to repent of their sin. You want them to change. You want God to work in their heart. And honestly, no matter how scared you are of that person, no matter how abused, you feel there's always part of you that still loves them and still hopes that they will change. And so for me, every time I've had to cut off someone who is abusive, it feels like cutting off your right arm. It hurts so bad. But I had to come to a place where I had to go back to, look, God is my ultimate father. God is the ultimate man God, I'm submissive to. He's the ultimate person who I answer to. And so if my relationship with this person is damaging my faith, if they're getting between me and my relationship with Jesus Christ, if they're impeding my ability to be a good wife to my husband, if they're damaging my emotional stability or my mental health, and I'm not able to be a stable, calm, loving mother to my children, that's a major red flag, and that's a problem, and it's unacceptable. And so those have been my three things. My relationship with God is the most important thing ever. And if anybody gets between that, God takes priority, and that's it. My relationship with my husband, I've had abusers try to convince my husband that I'm crazy, that I imagined everything, that he needs to take me to a psychiatrist because I'm delusional. And try to convince me that my dad or that my husband is like my dad. These mind games. My dad used to tell me that I was a piece of meat and that all men, including Jason, viewed me that way. And so when you have an abuser in your life who's damaging your marriage, who's intentionally causing stress in your life that's hurting your relationship with your spouse, that's also unacceptable. And of course, as a parent, I want to be the parent that I never had. I want to be the loving protector, and I can't do that if I'm depressed and anxious and suffering from insomnia because I'm having nightmares. So that was really, those are the things that have ultimately led to me working up the courage to cut off an abuser.
That's great advice. Thank you for sharing that with us. The next thing I want to know is you have mentioned how, not only did your dad lie to you, but other people around the situation were lying as well. Did having so many people like this around you affect your ability to trust Christians or men? And how did it affect it? And then how were you able to kind of get some more true perspective on the issue?
Absolutely. Abuse absolutely did damage and impede my ability to trust God and to trust others. Partly because, there's the big eternal question of, God, why are you letting this happen to me? Why are you letting this happen in my life? And so I had to wrestle with that. And I had to wrestle with God and confront God with that and, just flat out tell God, look, I'm angry at you. I know that you know everything, so I hope it's okay for me to confide this, but I'm really upset. I'm angry at you. I feel betrayed, and I need you to know this. And when I finally was able to confront God with my feelings, even though he already knew my feelings, because he knows everything, right? He made me. When I was finally able to confide those things, he gave me peace. And I got an overwhelming sense that it was okay, that he understood, and that he is sovereign, and that I can trust him both with my feelings and really with my whole life. The ways that it damaged my ability to trust have been ongoing, and it's gotten a lot better. I do find it difficult to have close friends. Obviously, I don't have much difficult confiding in other people. I'm just talking about this on a podcast, right? But it's one thing to talk about something that's happened in your past, and it's another thing to emotionally attach yourself to a person, to really become invested in their lives. And currently, I think that would be the hardest thing that I struggle with, is just getting close to people, because I have a fear that I'm going to be abandoned or betrayed on some level, whether that be, someone just really turning out to be a bad person, or just growing disinterested in me and kind of drifting slowly out of my life. Those are fears that I have. And I think a lot of that is rooted not only in my abuser, but also in people who saw the abuse and either covered it up or did nothing. And also people who maybe should have realized what was going on and didn't understand. And so there's two levels to it. There's the distrust that people are going to understand and sympathize and be proactive in helping you. But then there's also the fear that people are going to actually be negligent and actually enable abuse by not standing up against it or not thinking that it's a big deal.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute as well, because while I want this episode to be really helpful for someone who has struggled with or suffered from abuse in the past, or maybe there's things going on right now currently, but I also want to give some really good insight into those of us who haven't necessarily suffered from this level of abuse in the past, but still we are all involved at church, or we know people in our life, we have neighbors, just in our families. There's so many potential opportunities where someone that we know could be at risk. So how do we, just as normal average churchgoers, pay attention and notice what's going on? Are there signs that we need to look out for? Are there things that we need to proactively do just to kind of help prevent this abuse from happening in the first place? And then if it is happening, to be able to recognize it and do something about it.
Absolutely. Well, one thing I think that's important to understand is that someone who is an abuser, they've been developing and honing and feeding this sin in their heart for many, many years. And if they are determined to do evil, unless you're a mind reader, it's going to be really hard to predict. And, there's no knowing when or where they're going to do it. So it's very hard to prevent. Your best bet, as far as like a church or a school, is to take commonplace precautions. For example, when you're talking about nursery workers, make sure there's always 2 or more people in the room with a child. That changing, diaper changing areas, bathroom areas are visible to more than one person, so no one's ever alone with that child in a secluded area. There's a lot of common sense precautions you can take in those realms. But obviously, if if a parent has decided to abuse their child, it's really hard to anticipate that, and it's really hard to stop it from happening. And the best thing you can do is to be open to listen to that child when they come to you. And one of the things I would tell people is my dad has anger issues. And they didn't understand what that meant. They thought, okay, maybe her dad has a temper. Maybe he has road rage. These are not, it's sin, obviously, but it's not a crime. So they didn't understand. And what I would just encourage people to do is, when a child tells you something like that, ask questions. What does that mean to you? What are anger issues? What does your dad do exactly? Tell me specifically, in the child's words, and of course, a child's not going to come to you and say, I've been sexually abused. A, they don't know what abuse is, and B, they don't even know probably what sex is. So they don't have this vocabulary to talk to you. So you really are going to have to listen carefully and read between the lines and discern what that child means. It takes a lot of wisdom.
And another thing I wanted to add on to what you just said, which is fantastic advice about asking more questions, but just wanted to interject as well, just having gone through, like when you volunteer at school or church and they have you go through all the trainings, another thing that's really important as well is to not ask leading questions, or to not tell the child, did your dad do this, or did your dad and put the words in their mouth. Just because there's psychological studies that have been done where if you introduce new thoughts, it can affect their memories, especially in small children. So making sure that you are asking open-ended questions, like, you tell me what happened, not giving them a multiple choice of, did he do this, did he do this, just because legally and such too, that can make a difference, because it can affect, if it goes legally, that can affect the trial as well.
Absolutely. And children, too, like we said, they don't have the vocabulary. So they're going to repeat what you say. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind. And, that goes part of this, the precautions I was mentioning earlier too, like, for example, making sure that there's two people in a room with a child, maybe in a nursery setting or a changing a diaper setting. It protects the child, obviously, but it also creates accountability. So, if the child does go home and say something strange that could be interpreted in a strange way, a fellow nursery worker can say, oh, no, I was there. This is what happened. Everything's fine. So it protects the child, but it also protects innocent adults as well.
Yeah, that's important too, especially in today's society where you want to believe the best in people, and maybe it's someone you go to church with, or your kids go to school together, and you want to think of them as a friend, and not saying to be suspicious to everybody, because
absolutely, yeah, you need that accountability, and it just gives the parents peace of mind, really.
Yeah. So I want to switch gears again back to your book, because you wrote a book, Not Forsaken, a story of life after abuse, how faith brought one woman from victim to survivor. Can you tell us more about this book? Is it just your memoir, your story, or what all can we expect to find in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually, I have a copy right here, Not Forsaken. And it is, the first chapter is memoir, so you'll have kind of snapshots from my childhood. Part of the reason we put those in the first chapter is so that to establish, I guess, my credibility, so that you can understand like where I'm coming from, why I've written this book, but also so that abuse survivors who may be reading this, if they find it too stressful or too depressing, they can skip that entire chapter and they can go straight to chapter 2 and get on with the book. So that's twofold. But the whole, really, I would say it's kind of self-help, kind of theology, kind of memoir. It's a blend of all these things. So basically what it does is it chronicles my recovery process. It goes through learning to relate with Christ, because, Jesus suffered abuse. He was abandoned, and he was betrayed, and he was beaten and murdered. So learning to relate with Jesus on that very deep and profound personal level. Learning to understand what it means that God is our Father in a good and healthy way. Dealing with anger at God. Coping with depression and anxiety from a biblical standpoint, and in a way that's safe and that's going to lead us towards spiritual healing. So it goes through all these different milestones that I experienced in my recovery process. And also during the writing and the editing process, I interviewed over 100 survivors. And I was able to kind of identify commonalities in our recovery processes and feature challenges that are common to many victims and survivors, and kind of prioritize those issues, and hopefully give people a tool that they can use to further their, and facilitate their own recovery.
Yeah, so I was just getting ready to ask you before you said that last bit, but I'll ask you anyways. So the topic of abuse is not something that most people want to talk a lot about, especially if it's something you've gone through in the past. Most people don't want to put up a big sign and share that with the whole world. So what made you want to actually go through the whole book writing process to dive deep into these topics and turn it into a book that's now permanent and it's out there. Why? What made you want to take this journey?
I had been wanting to write a book for probably a decade, but I hadn't gotten to a level in my own recovery where I think I really understood even what had happened to me and where I could put it all into words. And finally, about 2 years ago, some different things happened in my personal life and some relationships resolved, and I reached some various milestones in my healing, and I was able to finally put to words how I felt. And I wanted to communicate it to my husband. He's a wonderful, godly man, and he's very sympathetic, but he's never been abused. And there were certain stories and certain feelings that I had that I wanted to communicate, but I didn't feel confident sharing face to face. So I wanted to put those into words. And so the book actually started as a series of letters to my husband, just telling him what I was going through and explaining why I am the way that I am. And as I wrote them, I went through a process of self-discovery. And I started to realize that not only was this helping me heal, but that possibly this could help other husbands or other survivors or even pastors, counselors, different people who want to be involved in the lives of people who are suffering. And so I just really felt a calling to put to words what I was going through and analyze it and use the gospel as a foundation to point a path toward spiritual recovery in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I really appreciate that you did that because this sounds like it's going to be such an amazing resource. So, for anybody who is watching or listening to this podcast episode, if this sounds like a book that you are interested in, definitely go ahead and check the show notes. I'm going to link to her book, and so you can go and check it out and learn more about this book and, all the things that she's talking about. But before we go, I have two more questions. One is, are there any other resources that our listeners should know about as well for me to put in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely. My friend Sarah Walton has a book called Hope When It Hurts. It's not specifically about abuse, but it's about enduring seasons of hardship and sorrow in light of the gospel. David Murray also has a large collection of wonderful resources dealing with depression, anxiety, and how to think about those from a healthy Christian perspective. So often, we hear that, oh, you just need to trust God a little more. You need to have stronger faith. You need to pray about it. But those are really unhelpful responses because, like my husband said, he told me at one point, you're not depressed because there's anything wrong with you. And you're not depressed because you're sinning. You're depressed because you've had a depressing life. Depressing things have happened to you. You're anxious because anyone would be anxious after going through what you've gone through. And so, there's different kinds of depression and anxiety. Obviously, there's those things as a chemical imbalance, or a mental disorder, emotional disorder, and so in those cases, there's a place where you may need a medical intervention. And I've been there. I've had postpartum depression. God made medicine, and God gave us doctors, and I'm very thankful. And there's also, a legitimate time to weep. Jesus wept when Lazarus died. And Jesus wept in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was so anxious that he sweated blood. So there is great freedom in knowing that godly men of the Bible and the Son of God himself suffered and wept and worried and were afraid. So I, just be encouraged that you are absolutely not alone and you are not forsaken.
All right, the last question I have for you today before I let you go. Is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners today, whether that's somebody who has suffered from abuse in the past, or for the friends and family members of those who have, or even for the church community as a whole? Do you have some sort of message or something that you always say that you wish you could just get out to the world?
You know, if I could go back 10, 15, 20 years to my younger self, I think what I would tell myself is God's going to get you through this. And God is faithful even when we are not. You know, you may feel like you're losing your grip on your faith. You may feel like you're losing your grip on your sanity. You may not want to be alive anymore. But it's not about your grip on your faith or on your sanity. It's about God's grasp on your soul. And God absolutely is faithful, and he is all powerful, and he is good. And I would just encourage you to hold on and confide in the Lord. And as far as to friends and churches and loved ones of abuse victims and survivors, I would just say thank you so much for being involved in their life. God has given you a tremendous, hard, a tremendous opportunity to help people. And, you know, Jesus gives us the story of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan finds a man who has been abused. He's been beaten up and robbed and left in the dirt at the side of the road. And as far as we're told, he doesn't give any profound advice. He doesn't have all the right words, but he picks that man up and he takes him to someone who can help him. And you know, you may not always feel like you have all the right words, and you may not feel like you can fix the whole situation. Honestly, nobody but God can. So it's okay. You're just one person. You are one church. You have limited capacity. You can only do what God enables you to do, right? And with the opportunities he gives you. So, you know, look at it as an opportunity. Don't feel pressured to in-house it or DIY it. Do your best, be prayerful, and be encouraged that God put you in this situation, and he loves you, and he is faithful, and he will give you the right words at the right time.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, so much for agreeing to be on this podcast today to share your experience with us. You've been so vulnerable and honest and helpful, and I really appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and thank you so much.
All right, so that just about does it for today's episode. If you've enjoyed listening to Jennifer throughout this episode and would love to hear more from her, either about her story or about more helpful tips and tricks for you, how you can overcome the abuse you've dealt with in your past or help out friends and family who may have gone through similar situations in their own life, I would really encourage you to go check out her brand new book that just came out recently. It is called Not Forsaken, A Story of Life After Abuse, How Faith Brought One Woman from Victim to Survivor. I'll have a link for it in the show notes below, so definitely check those out, as well as the other resources that I'll link there as well. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode and you want to listen to even more, we come back regularly to share all kinds of different perspectives, advice, strategies, tips, and tricks on how to be that amazing, godly woman God is calling you to be. So if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, make sure you do that right now, and we will talk to you again real soon. All right, bye.